Hello friends! If you're new here, my name is Kat and I make videos about books, writing and other random things living rent-free in my neurodivergent brain. So today we're doing some decluttering. I went through 2 bookshelves just now and now it's a bit of a mess at my feet, but I've made some tough decisions and I have quite a few books that I want to part way with. The first shelf that I went through was all about animals and the different topics of animal intelligence, animal advocacy, and all of that interesting stuff. I have quite a few books that I'm gonna unhaul from this pile, and it was a bit difficult to part way with them, but I think it's part of the process of understanding my fantasy self and the person I was in the past and who I am now, and kind of reconciling those different things and making sure that my bookshelf reflects the person that I am now. All the books that I'm going to release into the world are in French except one, so I'm just going to quickly go through them in categories. The first category is novels. A few years back, I wanted to write a book raising awareness about the plight of farmed animals and just the sheer amount of suffering that they are encountering and the unnecessary pain that we're putting them through and the horror of those systems. At the time, there was not really any novel about this topic and it was still quite neglected and not talked about that much. Since then, there have been quite a few novels on this topics or similar, and I feel it's a much less neglected topic now. It's much more understood and widespread, so I really don't feel the need for writing this book anymore. I'm not really excited about that project anymore, also because I've moved on, I guess, to a degree from that topic. Like, I still very much believe in those ideas and I'm still horrified by how we're treating farmed animals. But yeah, it's not a priority book that I want to write anymore, especially because now there are a number of novels doing that probably very well. So in the beginning, I was kind of collecting them when they started being published to compare and do research and kind of understand the market. I've never ended up reading them, and again, I don't think that I'm gonna do so now, so I'm gonna release those books. Next are just a few more theoretical books on the same topic. I think they're likely to be still very interesting, but there are a few other ones that I've decided to keep, and realistically, I don't think I'm gonna get to those anytime soon, if ever. So I've kept a smaller selection of that type of books and I'm going to release a few of them. And then the last 2 from my animal focus shelf are 2 volumes from a French magazine that's kind of very much a kind of advocacy, awareness raising magazine, and the topics are quite interesting. It's like animal, and the next one is like living, which is a bit like, it's more of a concept in French than English. I'm not sure how to translate it, but I looked at the table of content and there is nothing that I'm super drawn to right now. I mean, the topics are very interesting, that's why I purchased those magazines in the first place, but there's nothing in there I think I couldn't find somewhere else, even online for free. And even though there's a lot of editorial work that went into this, like, it's a very beautiful object, just the layout and the typography work is kind of giving me a headache. So I just don't feel like I'm gonna pick this up anyway. So I'm happy to find someone who will be excited to read them. Now onto the books that I want to keep. I will try to go through them very quickly because otherwise this video is gonna take ages. This is a French novel about the challenges of having wolves in the mountains area, so I'm quite curious to read that. I've read a couple of novels on a similar topic about bears, and so I'm curious to see the perspective on the wolf topic. This is a Hungarian novel from a very, very famous writer that I've never read anything from. And this novel is about this little dog that has a lot of personality but doesn't really fit into the tight manners of the high society of the 20th century in Hungary. This is a novel about the last specimen of a species of penguin, and it's a bit of a historical novel. I read this and really, really loved it, so I'm gonna keep it. This one is an excellent reference book about the history of meat, which I really enjoyed. This one is a thick novel about animal activists, and I said I released quite a few novels on a similar topic that I'm not going to read, but from this one, what I'm really interested about is kind of the activist angle. The other ones were more about kind of the reality of like animals on a farm, so it might be following the history of a family, having an animal farm and things like that. This one is from the activist point of view, so I'm curious to read that. This is a reference book on the emotions of farmed animals. One of the novels I was referring to about the presence of bears in the Pyrenees, which I really enjoyed. Another novel about animal activism that I'm curious about. This is an interview with an oceanologist and diver and his perspective on sharks and climate preservation and all of those topics. This is a comic book about the intelligence of fish, which was absolutely fascinating, and it's also signed by the author. A reference book about platypus, which is one of my favorite animals. This is a science book about the test of the mirror and how dolphins happen to pass this test and what it means about their intelligence. The Bird Cottage, I'm not sure if it's a novel or if it's a biography, but it's about this woman who decided to live her urban life and move into a cottage and spend time watching birds and learning more about their behaviors, their kind of society and all of that good stuff. This is a bird watching book to help me identify the birds that I might see in my garden and other places. Animal Liberation by Peter Singer is kind of the OG of books on speciesism and the animal advocacy world, so obviously I want to keep that. Another science book, this time about the intelligence of dogs. This is an essay from a French researcher about why we are so inclined to deny intelligence to animals, where we refuse to accept that they are intelligent, sentient creatures. I'm very curious to read this. A tiny book about bears. This one is also a classic from the animal advocacy world. It's The Sexual Politic of Meat, I think would be the title in English. It's basically how the question of animal domination intersects with feminist questions. Zoopolis is a philosophy book about what the world could look like after we recognize animals for what they are and give them a proper place in our society. Another very famous book about animal intelligence, a philosophy book about the paradox of meat and how people have cognitive dissonance when they love animal and want to make sure that they're not suffering, but they're also eating meat, and how their brain is working to try to reconcile the two. Another short book about animal intelligence, and one about dogs and their behavior and how intelligent they are. Again, another book about animal intelligence. I think you can start to see a pattern here. This one I've already read and quite enjoyed, but the author is an ethologist, which means that she studies animal behavior. And because she specialized on marine mammals, she had to do that in marine parks. So she had a biased interest in talking positively about those and not saying bad things about marine parks, which led to some disagreement from me with what she was saying, but the rest of the book was quite interesting, so I will keep it as a reference. Back to the topic of reintroducing bears and wolves in the Pyrenees in France. This is a book about kind of wild species coming back into some regions and kind of the challenges that that presents. The second novel about bears in the Pyrenees that I also quite enjoyed. Then I have 2 books about training your dog. This one is a classic and this one is kind of just like a lighter book, but it's in Swedish, so that's a good practice book for me as well. Next, this is a lovely illustrated book, children book about fantastical facts on animals, and I just love the art style. I really like this artist. I actually have a tattoo with one of her designs. And then the final book on this shelf is Animal Behavior, which is a textbook on, again, animal behavior. It's a classic, a reference, and it's one that's kind of very recommended on the topic, so I want to keep that. Now moving on to the second shelf I went through today, which is my business/professional development/DEI shelf. If you don't know, DEI is the acronym for diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is an area that I work with a lot in my job in people operations and human resources. I've decided to let go of 3 books from this shelf. The first one is The Best Place to Work. I've read this in the past and I have some remaining notes, but not from the entirety of the book. But weirdly, it didn't leave a very strong impression on me. I don't remember much about it. And I feel like if I want to revisit it, it's going to be rather easy to find a summary somewhere. So I think I can let it go. Next is The Making of a Manager, which I also read and quite enjoyed. But there is another book that I'm keeping, which is the best book I've read about management. And so this one, even though was good, didn't really match the level. And so I think I can just keep my notes from it and that's going to be enough. Finally, I have Swarmwise, which is from the man who started the pirate parties, I believe, in the UK. It's talking about tactics to get people engaged in your ideas and try to change the world. I very much still am interested in the topic, but just the look of the book, the lack of margins and all of that, just, I don't know, I'm not feeling massively excited about it. It feels a bit cheap and maybe I'm just badly judging the book, but realistically, I'm also not sure when I would get to this. So yeah, I think I'm gonna let it go, and if I want to return to this topic, I will search online for other resources. On to the books that I want to keep. Building a Second Brain by Tiago Forte, which I really enjoyed. I think it's a very practical book. He's also on YouTube and have a lot of interesting tips and recommendations, so I want to keep that so I can refer to it later. Upstream, which is about solving problems before they arise. I think working in operations, that's a mindset that's very, very useful, and I really enjoyed the book. Getting Things Done is a classic of productivity that I want to keep for reference. Thanks for the feedback. I haven't read that yet, but I'm still very keen to do so, so I'm keeping it. Managing to Change the World. This is a management book specifically for nonprofits, so it's very relevant to me, but I haven't read it yet. 4,000 Weeks, which is a very popular time management book, but with a different take. I really enjoyed the ideas in this book and I definitely want to reread it at some point. Better Than Before and The Happiness Project, 2 books by Gretchen Rubin, which is one of my favorite authors, so I'm gonna keep them. This is a book about DEI for international organizations. I still need to read this and I very much want to keep it. Next, I have some books about disability that I very much want to read and that I've heard very, very good things about. So I think those are going to be very helpful to educate myself more on this topic. This is the book about management that I was talking about. It's the best book I've read on the topic. It's super practical, lots of good tips that I've used in my day-to-day work and really loved it. So definitely keeping it. Off the Clock is one of the many books by Laura van der Kam, who is a time management expert at this point. I really like this and want to keep it. Next, I have Essentialism and Effortless, 2 books by the same author that are in the same vein as the minimalism movement. I quite like those, so I want to keep them. The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety. This is something I want to read for work. A book about burnout. I started reading this and I was not fully convinced, but I would want to give this book a second chance. The Art of Life Admin. I love this book and it opened my eyes to a lot of things. I very, very much recommend, and I also want to reread it hopefully soonish. The Fearless Organization. It's another book about psychological safety that I read for work and really enjoyed. Then I have a couple of books on the topic of race that I'm really curious to get to and that I want to read to educate myself a bit more on this topic. Next is The Culture Map. Honestly, this book is a classic at this point on the topic of intercultural communication. It's very, very interesting and very useful. I think about this book constantly and highly recommend it. A World Without Email from Cal Newport. I really enjoy this author's work. He's also on YouTube. He has a podcast and a bunch of useful resources. I'm yet to read this, so hopefully sometime soon among all the other many books that I want to read. The Checklist Manifesto, which I think is going to be very useful from an operations standpoint, so curious to read this. Decisive, so a book about how to make better decisions. This is from the same authors of the Upstream book that I showed earlier. Very keen to read this. DI Deconstructed is another book I want to read for work. I've heard so many good things about this book, and the author is on LinkedIn and just delivering amazing insights and advice and just value on the DI topic that I'm really, really keen to read this, and I think it's going to be excellent. Atomic Habits. Do I even need to present this book at this point? And finally, Deep Work, again by Cal Newport, a book that I very much enjoyed about really bringing value into the work that you do and finding ways to be focused in a very distracting and distracted world. Another day, another shelf. I went through 2 more shelves, and so I have a few books that I'm gonna get rid of and few uncertainties. From the first shelf, I have those 3. So this is a magazine, and those are 2 travel books from the region. I'm not sure what to do with them. I kind of like them. I kind of want to keep them, but the reality is that I don't really use them. So I think what I'm gonna do is keep them more at hand and see in the next few months if maybe I can pick them up to go on some adventures, or if I really don't reach for them and only do my research on the internet, then maybe I can let them go. The next small batch is a couple of books about neurodivergence, and this one felt too academic for me. I have a few notes in there which I might extract, and then those 2, I had read the first one and thought it was fine, but didn't really bring anything to me. So I'm not sure about keeping the other one because I don't know, it felt a little bit superficial, but it's covering a different topic as well. So this one I'm a bit unsure, and I also had this idea of just keeping all the books I have around neurodivergence in case I want to, I don't know, like create a list, make a reference or something and revisit them in the future. So I'm a bit undecided about those. And then the next batch I'm gonna let go is just a bunch of vegan cookbooks, which is all very nice. Like some of them are very, very pretty with beautiful pictures. But basically I tend to search for my recipes online mainly, or I have a few cookbooks that I really like that are in the kitchen. So I tend to gravitate toward those more. So what I'll do, I have a little bit of work with them before I can let them go, but it's just go through them and take pictures of the few recipes that I want to keep for later. Now moving on to the books I want to keep, and again I will go through them very quickly. So my first shelf was about travels, eco-living and gardening. The first 3 didn't all belong on that shelf, but they were in my TBR for June and I didn't get to them. I still very much want to read them, so I'm obviously gonna keep. Next, the Greenwich. I hesitated about this one because I started reading another one from the same collection and I was not too enthralled. It didn't really feel like something I really enjoyed. But I don't know, there is something about it. It's super cute and I'm still somehow intrigued, and I'm feeling like, oh, that could maybe serve as research for like a future book or something. So I'm having a bit of a hard time letting it go, so I'm gonna keep it for now. Then a tiny book about identifying trees. This one is an essay about getting ourselves out of consumerism culture. And two books about Venice that I really enjoyed. I don't think they're available in English, which is a shame. This one is a novel and this one is an essay collection, and they both talk about how tourism is destroying Venice and leading to political decisions that are just very bad for the city. Next, this is a bilingual edition of folk tales and fairy tales about Venice, a book I bought on my last trip to Venice. Like you can see, there is a theme here, which is about kind of how the city was built and grew. A gorgeous coffee table book about Venice again. Map Mania, which is a book I got in Japan with a bunch of really cool maps. I'm a sucker for maps, so I really like this. Then two little travel books from Warsaw and Venice. This is, I believe, a memoir from Saramos about living in Iceland. This is an essay or research book about the food chain in France and how unsustainable it is, and how like supermarkets could run out of stock in just a couple of days. The OG book about zero waste, and another memoir from Alice Vincent on how caring for plants helped her get out of a heartbreak. A little magazine about using plants to dye things. A practical guide on how to regrow vegetables from leftovers. Grounding, which I've mentioned a few times already on this channel. A little book about creating a forest garden. This one is about handling eco-anxiety, so the feeling of anguish that we can get thinking about the state of the climate and the planet, and I very much need this. A collection of stories of people who've decided to live a more light lifestyle and kind of living off the grid, or making choices that reduce the amount of things they consume and their impact on the planet. This is a travel guide, but a bit of a special one. It's basically a collection of portraits from people who live in Tokyo, telling their story about what they like about the city, what they don't like, kind of giving you a very nuanced view of the city, and they also share their favorite addresses of the city. Another classic travel book about Japan. A really cool travel book about how to see the world without leaving France. So, for example, there is a reference to a traditional Japanese garden, which you can see in France and feel like you're transported to Japan. So that's the whole concept of the book, which I found really cool and I need to explore more. Another beautifully illustrated travel book about mysterious places on the planet. And two books about hiking. A tiny guide on how to garden if you don't have a garden. I do have one now, so I purchased this when I was living in an apartment, but I think there might still be some useful tips for optimizing the space and things like that, so I still want to have a look into this. A guide on how to compost. A little book about having a vegetable garden, or a garden in general, that is better equipped against climate change. This is a magazine about having a beautiful garden all year round, so kind of suggestions of flowers that you can plant that will bloom at different seasons. A little book about permaculture. A gorgeous comic book about Simon, who created an oasis in his backyard, kind of bringing back a lot of diversity. The Bible on creating a forest garden. Another book on permaculture. A really nice book about landscape design. Another book's about growing your own garden. And the last one from this shelf, a book in Swedish with kind of hacks for the garden, like little tips and tricks on doing things around the garden. I really liked it. It was pretty cool. It's beautifully illustrated as well. And so that's gonna help me practice my Swedish and learn a little bit of garden vocabulary in Swedish. Moving on to my next shelf, which was a bit of a mix. The main theme was the mind, so it included books about rational thinking, neurodivergence, things like that. But that's also where I kept my cookbooks, so not related, again, a bit of a mix. To start with, two books from Barbara Scher about being able to do a lot of different things, being basically what she calls a scanner, but that's also named by other communities as multi-potentialite. The Year of Less, which is slightly out of place. I read this, absolutely loved it, and I listened to it on audiobook, so I wanted to have a physical copy as well. This is an essay about propaganda and how to manipulate people's thinking in democracy. This is another essay questioning what we think is common sense. Factfulness, which is a bit of a modern classic, I would say at this point. It's about how the world is not going as bad as we tend to think it is. So kind of bringing, again, objectivity and facts into how things are going. This is a book about high intellectual potential. It's the best one I've read on the topic. It's a comic book and it's very well done. I loved this book. Another comic book about high intellectual potential. 2 books by the same author about neurodivergence in women. This is very much a textbook on neurodivergence for psychologists and therapists, focused again on high intellectual potential, and I'm very curious to dive into this, although that might be a bit too advanced for me. We'll see. Then a bit of an outlier. This is a comic book about the body, so kind of bringing into contributions from different writers and artists. I'm very curious to read that. And then 2 books about food that I decided to keep. This one is about vegetarian and vegan Japanese cooking, and this one is about making bread. I mean, I'm French, what do you expect? So a few books about rational thinking and thinking better in general. Then this book about kind of extreme morality, how people can go to extreme lengths to save strangers. Then an essay about kind of group thinking and how thinking in a group kind of influences us too much and can be a danger to democracy. Probably the foundational book of the effective altruism movement, which is about using facts, evidence, rationality to figure out the best way to do the most good in the world. This is one of my favorite nonfiction ever. It's about how just introducing a speckle of doubt in science and research can have devastating effects, and that's why we still have people questioning climate change or things like that. Honestly, it was a bit of a heartbreaking book, but it's very well done and very eye-opening, so I would absolutely recommend it. This is a book that I read a while back. I don't remember much of it, but I think it argues that basically there's not as much depth to our mind as we think. And so psychology and psychiatry are basically scams. If I remember correctly, I don't want to put wrong words into this author's mouth, but I remember being quite skeptical about his point of view, and so I would want to revisit this because I found it interesting, but again, I don't remember much of it. This is a book I absolutely want to get to at some point. I kind of like the design, and it's about why we make mistakes and why we kind of reject responsibility for them. The Scout Mindset, which is another book about thinking better and rationally. Insight, which is in between a self-help book and a science-y book on self-awareness and self-knowledge. And then finally, this comic book that I really enjoyed about some of Pierre Bourdieu's work. Pierre Bourdieu was a very famous sociologist and did a lot of work around kind of class identities and how our class origin kind of influences our taste. So that's it for today. In total, over the next 2 days, we did 4 shelves, and I have 4 left in this room, which I'm quite happy about. I've made good progress, and if you're still here, thank you so much for bearing with me through that process. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.